Have you ever felt like you're not alone, even in the safest place you know? Imagine waking up in your own home with an unsettling sensation of being watched, only to find that the darkness itself is alive, aware, and closing in on you. What starts as a typical night quickly transforms into a relentless, horrifying chase where the shadows are not just hiding something, they are something. In this bone-chilling tale, experience a night of terror as the ordinary becomes terrifyingly sinister. The protagonist's struggle to understand and escape the living darkness unfolds in a way that will make you question every shadow and whisper. As the darkness morphs from a passive presence into a menacing force, the horror escalates beyond comprehension. Hold tight and keep your lights on as you delve into a story where fear is not just in what you see but in what you can't see. This is not just a story of survival but of confronting an entity so malevolent that it hunts the protagonist with a relentless fury. Will the protagonist escape the suffocating grasp of the darkness, or will the malevolent void claim yet another soul? Stay with us until the end, and prepare yourself for a journey into a nightmarish world where the shadows are alive, and there's no guarantee of daylight. It began like any other night. I had gone through my usual routine, brushed my teeth, set my alarm, and crawled into bed, letting the comfort of my familiar surroundings lull me toward sleep. The darkness of my room was a kind of sanctuary, the quiet and the stillness like a heavy blanket, reassuring and safe. But something dragged me out of the edge of sleep. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but there was an odd sensation gnawing at the back of my mind, like an itch I couldn't quite reach. I opened my eyes and stared into the blackness of the room. Everything was just as it should be, or so it seemed. The outlines of my furniture were barely visible in the faint moonlight that crept through the small gap in the curtains. It was quiet, eerily so, as if the night itself was holding its breath. But that's when I felt it, the unnerving sensation that made my skin crawl and my heart race. I was being watched. It was a bizarre thought, one that I tried to dismiss immediately. Who would be watching me? I was alone, safely locked inside my house, with no one else around for miles. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing second. It was like an invisible weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. My eyes darted around the room, searching for the source, but all I could see were shadows. Shadows that seemed to stretch and warp in the darkness, shifting just out of my sight. It was as if the room itself was alive, the blackness curling and twisting like smoke, forming shapes that my mind struggled to make sense of. My heart pounded in my chest, a steady, relentless drumbeat that echoed in my ears. The darkness didn't just look different, it felt different. It was heavier, denser, like it was swallowing up the very air around me. Then came the sound. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, a trick of the silence playing with my nerves. But as I lay there, straining to listen, I realized it wasn't just the usual hum of a quiet room. There was something else beneath it, something subtle yet deeply unsettling. Whispers. Faint and distant, like voices carried on the wind, barely audible but unmistakably there. I focused on the sound, trying to make out the words, but they were too quiet, too far away, like they were being spoken from the other side of a wall. Or maybe they weren't in any language I knew. The more I listened, the more I realized I didn't want to understand what was being said. There was something wrong, something deeply wrong, about those whispers. They weren't meant for me, and yet, they were all I could hear. My pulse quickened, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead as the fear began to take hold. What were those whispers? Who, or what, was making them? And why did I have the overwhelming feeling that they were meant for me? The thought was terrifying, and it made me feel impossibly small, like a child lost in the dark, surrounded by unseen dangers. I wanted to move, to reach for the light switch, but my body wouldn't respond. I was paralyzed by a fear so profound that it felt like it was seeping into my very bones. The room felt suffocating, the walls closing in as the shadows seemed to pulse with a life of their own. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, that there was nothing there, nothing to fear. But the whispers continued, growing ever so slightly louder, as if whatever was speaking was drawing closer. I forced myself to reach for my phone, my hand trembling as I fumbled in the darkness. The screen lit up, casting a weak glow that barely pierced the blackness around me. But it was enough to see that the shadows at the edge of the light were still moving, still shifting. I could feel the cold sweat trickling down my back, the hairs on my arms standing on end. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, I wasn't alone. Something was in the room with me, something that wasn't hidden by the darkness, it was the darkness. And it knew that I was aware of it. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, I wasn't alone. Something was in the room with me, something that wasn't hidden by the darkness, it was the darkness. And it knew that I was aware of it. My heart was pounding in my chest, each beat echoing like a drum in the silence. The glow of my phone screen was my only lifeline, but it felt weak and fragile, barely keeping the darkness at bay. I kept the light pointed outward, sweeping it across the room, trying to convince myself that it was just shadows, just the usual tricks that the dark plays on a tired mind. But the whispers, they were getting louder. At first, I thought I might be losing my mind. The voices were so faint, so distant, like an echo in a cave, yet they surrounded me, pressing in from all sides. I strained to listen, to make sense of the sounds, but they were too muddled, too foreign. I couldn't tell if the whispers were in a language I didn't understand, or if they were just too low and garbled to be decipherable. But one thing was clear, they weren't random. They had a rhythm, a pattern, like a conversation I wasn't meant to hear. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. Was someone outside my window? Was this some cruel prank? But as I shone the light toward the window, I saw nothing but the empty yard beyond, the faint outline of the trees swaying in the breeze. The whispers weren't coming from outside, they were inside, here with me. The realization sent a chill down my spine, a coldness that settled deep in my bones. I tried to shake it off, to tell myself it was all in my head, but the whispers persisted, growing more insistent, more deliberate. It felt as though they were trying to get my attention, to communicate something that was just out of reach. And then, for a brief moment, I thought I caught a word. It was so faint, so unclear, but it was there, buried beneath the layers of sound. My breath hitched as I tried to listen harder, to understand. But as soon as I focused, the word slipped away, lost in the jumble of voices. That was when the fear truly began to set in. The kind of fear that grips you so tightly it's hard to breathe, hard to think. My hands were shaking now, the light from my phone flickering slightly as I struggled to hold it steady. I wanted to run, to get out of that room, out of the house, to anywhere that wasn't here. But something kept me rooted in place, a mix of paralyzing terror and morbid curiosity. What were those voices saying? And why did I have the horrible feeling that they were talking about me? I realized I couldn't just lie there and wait for something to happen. I needed to do something, anything, to break the spell of the darkness and the whispers that seemed to pulse through it like a heartbeat. Slowly, carefully, I slid out of bed, my feet touching the cold floor. The whispers didn't stop, in fact, they seemed to intensify, like whatever was speaking knew I was trying to escape. The air in the room felt thick, almost tangible, like walking through a dense fog. Every step I took felt heavier, slower, as if the very darkness around me was trying to pull me back, to keep me from reaching the light switch on the wall. But I forced myself to keep moving, my eyes locked on the switch as though it were a lifeline. With every step, the whispers grew louder, more urgent. They were no longer a distant murmur, they were right there, just beyond the reach of the light, circling me like predators waiting to strike. I could almost feel the breath of the words on my skin, cold and moist, sending shivers down my spine. And then, as I reached out for the switch, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, a void that pressed against my ears with such force it was almost painful. The sudden absence of sound was more terrifying than the whispers had ever been. It was as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And in that silence, I felt it, the unmistakable sense of movement, of something shifting in the darkness just beyond my reach. My hand froze inches from the switch, my body paralyzed with fear. The darkness seemed to pulse, alive with a malevolent energy that I could almost feel radiating off the walls. And then I saw it, just for a split second, in the corner of my eye, a shadow that moved independently of the others, slipping through the darkness like a snake through grass. In that moment, I knew. The darkness wasn't just a backdrop for my fears, it was alive, aware, and it was closing in on me. The whispers, the shadows, the oppressive weight of the room, they were all part of something much larger, something that had been watching me all along, waiting for me to notice it. And now that I had, it wasn't going to let me go. My hand trembled, hovering just above the light switch, but I couldn't bring myself to flip it. A cold dread rooted me to the spot, my breath caught in my throat as the room seemed to close in around me. The silence was so thick it felt almost physical, pressing against my skin like a suffocating blanket. The whispers had stopped, but the air was heavy with a sense of anticipation, as if the darkness itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to make a move. I stood there, paralyzed, every nerve in my body on high alert, listening for any sign of movement. My eyes darted around the room, but the shadows were still now, their earlier writhing replaced by an unnerving stillness. Yet, I could feel something in the air, a presence that was undeniable. The darkness wasn't just a lack of light, it was something alive, something conscious, and it was aware of me. A low, almost imperceptible hum began to vibrate through the walls, a deep, resonant sound that I felt more than heard. It was as if the very structure of the room was trembling, reacting to some unseen force. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as sandpaper, and took a step back, the floorboards creaking beneath my weight. The sound echoed in the silence, unnaturally loud, as though the house itself was amplifying every noise, feeding off my fear. That's when I saw it, just at the edge of the light cast by my phone. The darkness was moving again, but not like before. This time, it wasn't just the flicker of shadows or the trick of the eye. The blackness itself seemed to pulse, to breathe, shifting and undulating as though it had a life of its own. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, but as I stared, I could see it more clearly, waves of darkness rolling like black smoke, coiling and uncoiling at the periphery of the light. A cold realization washed over me, more terrifying than anything I had ever experienced. The darkness wasn't just hiding something, it was something. It was alive, sentient, and it was watching me with a predatory awareness that sent chills down my spine. I could feel its attention, its focus, bearing down on me with an intensity that made my heart race and my legs weak. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet as the darkness seemed to surge forward, responding to my fear. The shadows at the edge of the light grew darker, denser, as though they were solidifying, taking shape. For a moment, I thought I saw a form within the darkness, a twisted, grotesque silhouette, its edges blurred and shifting like smoke, but undeniably there. Panic set in, raw and overwhelming. My mind raced, frantically trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but there was no rational explanation. No way to convince myself that this was just a bad dream, just a figment of my imagination. The darkness was alive, aware, and it was closing in on me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I fought to keep the light steady, the beam from my phone trembling as I pointed it toward the advancing shadows. But it was no use. The darkness was too strong, too overwhelming. It seemed to absorb the light, swallowing it up and growing thicker, more oppressive with every passing second. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, a biting cold that seemed to seep into my very bones, making me shiver uncontrollably. I wanted to scream, to shout for help, but my voice caught in my throat, strangled by the sheer terror that gripped me. The darkness was alive. It was thinking, planning, waiting. And now, it was hunting. The whispers returned, no longer faint or distant. They were clear now, each word sharp and distinct, cutting through the thick silence like a knife. You see us, you know the truth, the darkness knows you. The words echoed in my mind, a cold, relentless chant that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I felt the ground beneath me shift, as if the darkness was seeping into the floor itself, warping reality around me. My vision blurred, the edges of the room distorting as the shadows stretched and twisted, reaching out with inky tendrils that seemed to move with purpose. The darkness wasn't just an absence of light, it was a presence, a force with intent, and that intent was focused solely on me. Desperate, I flicked the light switch, but nothing happened. The bulb didn't even flicker. The darkness had consumed it, swallowed the light whole. My last hope was the phone, but even that seemed to be dimming, the screen's glow growing weaker, as if the battery was being drained by some unseen force. I was out of options, out of time. The darkness was closing in, and I was trapped, caught in its grip. My heart pounded in my chest, the blood roaring in my ears as the last vestiges of light flickered and died. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, their tone shifting from taunting to something darker, more malicious. They weren't just voices anymore, they were commands, demands. Join us, become one with the darkness, there is no escape. And in that moment, as the last sliver of light vanished, I realized the terrible truth. I was no longer afraid of what the darkness hid. I was afraid of the darkness itself. Because the darkness was alive, and it was hungry. The room was completely engulfed now, the light from my phone extinguished as if swallowed by a void. I was plunged into an abyss, the kind of darkness that makes you forget what light even looks like. It was thick, suffocating, a presence pressing down on me from all sides. My senses were in overdrive, every sound, every subtle shift in the air amplified by the overwhelming fear that gripped me. I could no longer see my hand in front of my face, and the whispers that had once been faint were now all around me, deafening in their intensity. They spoke in a cacophony of voices, overlapping and merging, some high-pitched and shrill, others low and guttural. The words were clearer now, no longer garbled, as though the darkness itself was finally revealing its true nature to me. Join us, you belong to the darkness, there is no escape. The words sent shivers down my spine, but what terrified me most was the sensation that the darkness was alive, pulsing with malevolent energy. It wasn't just a void, it was an entity with thoughts, intentions, and desires. And those desires were focused entirely on me. My chest tightened as I tried to move, to do something, anything, but it was as if the darkness had weight, pressing down on me, making it impossible to breathe. I staggered backward, reaching out blindly in the blackness, trying to find something solid, something real to hold on to. But my fingers grasped only air, and the floor beneath my feet felt uneven, as if it were shifting and warping under the influence of whatever malevolent force was at work. The darkness wasn't just around me, it was inside me. I could feel it creeping into my mind, seeping into my thoughts, warping my perception of reality. My memories began to blur, my sense of self dissolving as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They weren't just trying to frighten me anymore, they were trying to consume me, to make me part of the darkness itself. Panic set in, a raw, primal fear that tore through me like a storm. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat, strangled by the oppressive weight of the darkness. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening, but the more I thought, the more the darkness seemed to worm its way into my consciousness, twisting my thoughts, turning them against me. I could feel it now, something moving in the darkness. It wasn't just the shadows shifting anymore, it was something else, something alive, something that was reaching for me. I felt a cold, clammy touch on my arm, and I recoiled in horror, stumbling backward into the void. But no matter where I moved, the darkness was there, surrounding me, closing in on me. The whispers had turned into a low, droning chant, words that I could now understand clearly. They spoke of despair, of hopelessness, of surrendering to the inevitable. They promised an end to the fear, an end to the struggle, if I would only let go, if I would only give in to the darkness. And I was so tired. The fear, the confusion, the sense of utter helplessness, it was all too much. My strength was ebbing away, drained by the relentless pressure of the darkness. I could feel myself slipping, my will weakening as the shadows pressed closer, their cold touch now a constant presence on my skin. For a moment, I considered it, giving in, letting the darkness take me. It promised relief, an end to the terror that had consumed me. But as the thought crossed my mind, something deep inside me resisted, a spark of defiance that refused to be extinguished. I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. With a surge of desperation, I reached out again, this time not just blindly flailing in the dark, but with purpose. I had to find something, anything, that could help me, some remnant of the world I knew, the world of light and safety. My fingers brushed against the edge of the nightstand, and I grabbed hold of it, anchoring myself to that small piece of reality. The contact with something solid gave me a jolt of clarity, a reminder that there was still a world beyond this suffocating darkness. I wasn't just a victim, I was still here, still fighting. I fumbled across the nightstand, searching for anything I could use, and my fingers closed around the cold, hard surface of my phone. Hope flickered inside me as I pressed the power button, praying for the light to return, for some break in the suffocating blackness. The screen lit up, weak and flickering, but it was enough. For a brief moment, the darkness recoiled, as if stung by the sudden flare of light. But the reprieve was short-lived. The light was dim, the battery nearly dead, and the shadows at the edge of the room seemed to pulse with renewed anger. The whispers rose to a crescendo, furious and demanding, as if the darkness itself was enraged by my refusal to surrender. I had to move, had to get out of the room, out of the house, away from this living nightmare. But every step I took was a battle, the darkness clinging to me, pulling at me with invisible hands. I stumbled toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest, the air thick with the scent of decay, of something ancient and rotten that had been disturbed. Just as I reached the door, the light from my phone flickered and died, plunging me back into the suffocating blackness. The whispers surged, a triumphant chorus that seemed to shake the very walls around me. But I didn't stop. Blind and terrified, I yanked the door open and stumbled into the hallway, the darkness following me like a living shadow. I ran, my feet pounding against the floor, the cold air biting at my skin. But no matter how fast I ran, I could feel it behind me, chasing me, closing in. And as I reached the stairs, I realized with dawning horror that there was no escape. The darkness wasn't just in my room, it was everywhere, alive and aware, and it wasn't going to let me go. I was running blindly through the house, each step driven by sheer terror, my breath coming in ragged gasps as the darkness seemed to chase me through the corridors. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear the whispers, but their presence was unmistakable, a constant, low drone that grew more insistent with every step I took. The house, once a familiar refuge, now felt like a labyrinth of shadows, each corner and doorway a potential trap. The air was heavy and oppressive, making it hard to breathe, and the darkness seemed to pulse with a life of its own, shifting and writhing as if it were an extension of the fear that had consumed me. I reached the stairs, my legs trembling as I hurried down, nearly stumbling over the steps in my frantic flight. The darkness was closing in, its presence growing more palpable with every passing second. I could feel it wrapping around me, pressing in on all sides, trying to drag me back into its suffocating embrace. My phone was my only source of light, but the battery was nearly dead, the screen flickering weakly as if struggling to fend off the encroaching shadows. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I noticed that the light from the phone was casting strange, elongated shadows on the walls, distorted and twisted. The shadows seemed to stretch and reach out toward me, as if the darkness itself was trying to physically grasp me, to pull me into its depths. I had to keep moving, had to find a way out, but the house felt endless, each turn leading to more darkness, more despair. I burst into the living room, hoping for a reprieve, but instead, I found a room that seemed even darker, the shadows thicker and more impenetrable. The oppressive feeling was almost physical, a weight pressing down on me, making it hard to move, hard to think. The whispers had turned into a low, guttural growl, a sound that seemed to come from the very walls, resonating with an unnatural cadence that made my skin crawl. Desperation drove me to the window, my only hope of escape. I fumbled with the latch, my hands slick with sweat, my fingers numb with fear. Outside, the night was black and uninviting, the stars obscured by a heavy blanket of clouds. The darkness outside seemed to merge with the darkness inside, creating an impenetrable barrier that made me question if there was any place where I could truly be safe. The window finally gave way, swinging open with a creak that echoed through the empty room. I leaned out, hoping to see a way to escape, but instead, I saw only more darkness, a vast, empty expanse that seemed to stretch endlessly. The fear was overwhelming, a tangible force that made it hard to breathe, to think. I could feel the darkness closing in behind me, its cold, clammy presence reaching out to touch me, to drag me back into its suffocating grip. I knew I couldn't stay here, couldn't let it capture me. With a final burst of energy, I scrambled out the window, landing heavily on the grass outside. For a moment, I lay there, the cold ground pressing against me, the darkness still swirling around me but now more distant. I looked back at the house, its windows dark and empty, and I felt a pang of regret. Had I truly escaped, or had I merely postponed the inevitable? The darkness seemed to pulse and writhe within the house, a living entity that was still very much alive. It reached out toward me, its presence still palpable even from outside. I knew it wouldn't be long before it found me again, that the terror I had experienced inside the house was just the beginning. I stumbled to my feet, my legs weak and unsteady, and began to run. The night air was cold and stinging, but it was a relief compared to the suffocating darkness that had enveloped me inside. I ran through the yard, the grass crunching underfoot, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I fought to put as much distance between myself and the house as possible. But the darkness was relentless, a shadow that seemed to follow me no matter where I went. I could feel its presence, its anger, its hunger. It was a part of me now, a persistent reminder of the terror I had endured. And as I looked back one last time, I knew that the darkness wasn't just a force to be feared, it was a living nightmare, a predator that would never let me go. My only hope was to find help, to tell others what I had experienced, to warn them of the darkness that lurked within the walls of that house. But as I fled into the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that no matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, the darkness would always be just behind me, waiting for the right moment to strike again. And so, with every step I took, I carried the weight of that darkness with me, a constant reminder of the night I had faced a living terror and survived. But survival came with a price, and the price was knowing that the darkness was still out there, waiting, watching, and always hungry for the next soul to ensnare.